and I'm Afraid of My Human Girlfriend by J. Peasy. I think I wanted it at first. Being a werewolf was such a chaotic, wild experience. Constantly hanging on the edge of control, staring into the chasm of instinct and impulse, seeing how long I could teeter on the border of sanity. Melissa represented caution, discipline, and control. It had been like a sigh of relief, a release from responsibility, to be on a metaphorical leash. She grounded me, policed me, made sure I kept my nose clean. It started out self-imposed. I chose to stay in for the nights, chose to stay human. I couldn't let her find out about my condition, and on top of that, she was the perfect excuse to get me out of the weekly, if not nightly, hunts my pack always dragged me along for. After a while, though, I'm not sure exactly when, it stopped being self-imposed. After holding back from my carnal nature for a period of time, I began to crave it. But every time I decided to leave, my heart would start pounding. I'd start looking over my shoulder as I got ready, feeling guilty and, for some reason, apprehensive. These feelings strong enough to dissuade me from leaving. I remember the first time I saw Melissa standing in the threshold between the dining room and the kitchen, her hands on her hips, her eyes dull and calculating. My hand was on the doorknob, and she regarded me, frozen in that position, like an alpha would a pup who had taken more than his fair share of the kill.
"Where are you going?"
she asked. I swallowed, my mind searching for an explanation. I couldn't tell her I was a werewolf going to run with the pack.
You're not leaving for the night, are you?"
she said as her head leaned to one side critically. It was a question, but it wasn't a question. I turned my head to the side, my heart beating heavily in my chest. For a moment, indignation rose in me. I was a werewolf, a terrifying beast of the night. How dare this mere human instill such fear in me? My eyes happened to glance out of the window, and I saw the empty trash bin still sitting down at the end of the driveway. Relief flooded through me, and before I could think about what I was saying, I spoke.
"Of course not. I just happened to see the trash cans out there. Forgot to bring them in earlier, so I figured I'd run out and grab them now."
At that, Melissa's thin line of a mouth curled into a smile and she nodded. My quest for the trash cans had been approved. I turned away from her and opened the door, and that's when she said it, quietly but loud enough for me to hear.
"Good boy."
The hair on my arms stood up, and I paused in the doorway. My breaths became heavier, and thoughts and emotions raced through me, but I shoved all the implications aside. The trash needed to be brought in. That was a few weeks ago, and now the leash felt more like a noose. Every rebellious thought I had, every time I tried to pull away, I felt this closing grip around my throat, as pulling away only tightened the knot. Eventually, however, the need to leave, to run and to hunt was left so long unsated, it grew to match the feelings that held it back. Over the course of a few days, I built up the courage to confront Melissa, and on the night I'd told my pack I would join them, I approached her. I opened the door to the basement, and the rattling sound of the washing machine bounced up the stairwell to my ears. I swallowed and descended. The basement was unfinished, and Melissa stood on the concrete floor in front of the washer and dryer, two shining white pieces of machinery in an otherwise gray and brown basement. A single incandescent light bulb with a pull string hung over Melissa's head like a one-dimensional halo, casting hard shadows about the room. I reached the bottom of the stairs and waited. She was finishing up setting the dryer to run, and I didn't want to interrupt her. Finally, the dryer hummed to life, joining the running washing machine in a chorus of mechanical grumbles and clicks. Melissa heaved a basket of clean laundry up to rest on her hip, and she turned.
"Oh, Terry, did you need something?"
My voice caught in my throat, and I stared at her dumbly for a few minutes. Her eyes narrowed at me, and a shiver ran down my spine.
"Something the matter, Terry?"
she asked. I cleared my throat and steeled myself.
Some of my friends are going out for the night, and I'd like to..."
I stopped as the noose tightened. Melissa's face hadn't changed, but somehow it had. Her gaze burned into me. I could almost feel my skin peeling and curling from the heat. My eyes fell away from hers and settled on the basket weighing heavily on her hip. I took a step forwards and reached out my arms toward the laundry.
Here, let me take that. I can carry it upstairs, so..."
My voice trailed off as Melissa made no movement to allow me to take custody of the laundry basket. She just held her piercing gaze on me.
"Some friends of yours are going out for the night, and you'd like to..."
she echoed, using my exact tone until she curled the end of it into a question. My head dipped submissively, but I pressed on.
I'd like to..."
I swallowed and furrowed my brow. No, my words would not be a question or a request. I raised my head to meet her gaze.
"I'm going to head out with the..." "And you're telling me this at 9:30 at night?"
she asked sharply. My gut twisted.
"Well, I didn't mean to wait so long. I just... time got away from me. Here, let me take that laundry basket. I didn't think we had anything planned for this evening, so I didn't think about mentioning it until... now."
I rattled off as I reached again for the basket hanging at her hip. Again, she made no move to hand it to me.
"Upstairs,"
she stated, her voice terrifyingly devoid of emotion. My entire body tensed up. I didn't move. Melissa stepped around me and started up the stairs, her footstep heavy with the weight of the laundry she lugged along. I listened to her ascend, but I heard her stop at the top. The floor creaked as she turned around to regard me.
"Come."
My feet moved without thinking. My head stayed down. I traipsed up the stairs behind her and followed her as she walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She set the basket down in front of her and then patted the seat beside her. I moved to it and sat.
"Help me fold this laundry. Since you've been staying here, I've got double the amount I usually do. After this, I've got 2 more loads coming, though,"
she told me. My voice came out quietly.
"Last time I tried to help you you told me I was folding things the wrong way. And now you know the right way,"
she stated cheerfully. I felt a heat begin to rise in my chest.
"You just want me to help you so I can't go out."
Silence hung in the room like fog. Melissa said nothing, so I stood up.
"Down,"
she ordered. My body almost listened instinctively, and that made me angry. I let out a snarl and faced her, my heart pounding in my chest.
You do not order me around like that. I will tolerate it no longer."
Melissa turned her icy cold glare to me, and it took everything I had not to falter.
"I said, down,"
she repeated. My lips peeled back in a furious grimace, baring my teeth.
"Who do you think you are?"
Melissa's lips twitched, and then her mouth creased into a frown.
"Don't push it,"
she warned me. I laughed, incredulous.
"Don't push it? You've been pushing me around for weeks. I'm going out tonight whether you like it or not."
I stormed off toward the front door.
"Terry, stay,"
Melissa barked. I felt compulsion grip my chest, but it only infuriated me more. Something in me snapped, and a burning sensation spread through my entire body. I was going to change. I could not stop it, and I was fine with that. I hunched over as my bones and muscles twisted and snapped and grew. I felt my face stretch into a pointed snout, and hair crawled up through every inch of my skin. My teeth grew, my canines sharpened, my clothes ripped and parted into shreds. I let out a deep, guttural growl and spun to face Melissa. I would see such fear in her eyes. I would see in her the same apprehension she instilled in me. I reveled in the thought of her shrinking away, terrified of my true form. But the woman was doing no such thing. Slowly, she rose and stepped away from the couch, regarding me with something like disappointment and perhaps a bit of pity. Rage overtook me, and I lunged at her with a snarl. Melissa stood her ground, and I stopped an inch away from her face. There was no fear, no apprehension, no sense of mortal danger from her. I was several feet taller than her in my true form, and yet somehow she looked down on me. Her shape didn't change, but in my head she grew. She grew bigger than me, and she was stronger than me. That's what her eyes said. That's what her posture told me, and I could not bring myself to argue.
"Sit,"
she commanded, her face twitching into a moment of grimace as she spoke. My jaw snapped shut, and I fell to my hindquarters. Melissa's hand curled into a fist, save her index finger, which she pointed to the ground.
"Lay down."
Defeated, I let out a slight whimper as I willingly collapsed to the floor, placing my chin on the ground at her feet.
"Now stay,"
she bid me, a hint of irresistible softness entering her voice. I stayed there for a few moments, and she did nothing but breathe. Melissa slowly lowered herself into a squat, and her hand rested upon my head. Her knuckles curled, and she scratched through the fur between my ears.
"Good boy,"
she cooed quietly. I felt my body relax, and a euphoric sensation spread through every inch of my being. And I had never been more afraid. There's a werewolf in my town. I didn't believe in it until recently. By Summer and Tinkles. I think the sightings first started up about 10 years ago. That's the same time my family moved to this town. I was only 12 at the time. Since then, many have claimed to have seen some sort of wolf or hyena-like animal running around. Supposedly, it roams the forest at night, right next to our neighborhood at night. I went around and interviewed all the eyewitnesses. Every description was the same. They said it had thick brown fur and bright blue eyes. It also had the ability to stand on its hind legs, and it was about my height when fully upright. These sightings are common enough that even the law enforcement officers believe it's a werewolf. They say there are no officially recorded wolves or mountain lions or any other similar animals in this area that could explain the sightings. They've also tried to catch it more than once, but it clearly has a human level of intelligence, since it had always been able to evade them. And no one knows where it goes during the day. The sightings just seemed to get more and more common as the years flew by, to one point where even my parents had claimed to have seen it once or twice. My mother said she saw it running across the road while driving home from work late at night, while my father said he saw it creeping around our front yard before leaping over the fence and running back into the woods where it lurked. Everyone in this town claimed to have seen this werewolf at some point, except for me. I don't believe in the thing. Why should I? Everyone knows eyewitness accounts are the least reliable form of evidence, since they can be easily fabricated, exaggerated, or misinterpreted. That said, just recently, some extremely convincing physical evidence has been found. For instance, some people have photographed large footprints clearly canine in origin, but much larger than a fox or a coyote. More gruesomely, hikers have been finding carcasses with their necks and spines violently snapped open with powerful, bone-crushing jaws. Ever since these deaths turned up, everyone in town has been keeping their pets and livestock indoors at night for safety, especially since the creature seems to be losing its fear of humans, hence the recent sightings of it in urban areas. One of our elderly neighbors even claimed she saw it digging through her garbage right by her window. She says it turned right in her direction before going over to the window, pressing its muzzle against the glass and breathing powerful, hungry breaths before she ran to her bedroom, pulled the blanket over her head, and stayed there until morning. After hearing that story, I knew I had to get to the bottom of this. Even if it wasn't a werewolf, there was clearly something in our town wreaking havoc. Maybe a feral dog, or even an escaped hyena, and someone was keeping it as an illegal, exotic pet. I decided I was going to try and catch the creature on film myself, no matter how difficult it would be. I set up a camouflage tent in the backyard, right next to the forest, and brought with me a headlamp, a video camera, and a gun. The latter I brought just in case I needed to defend myself from this animal. I set up the camera on a stand right outside the tent, pointed it to the woods before crawling into my tent, zipping the door shut and falling asleep. The next morning, I felt a breeze coming in from the front of the tent. I sat up and nearly had a heart attack when I saw that there was a gigantic hole torn in the tent door. I peeked out of the hole and noticed the chewed-up carcass of a turkey lying in front of the tent, along with large paw prints surrounding it. He was here, I thought. I wanted to be excited, but I was mainly terrified. I had been extremely close to being this animal's dinner. The animal had torn open my tent, then, for whatever reason, decided I wasn't a worthy meal. Maybe the videotape will explain everything. I hooked the camera up to my computer and uploaded it before examining the footage. At the very beginning of the video, I saw myself setting the camera up before stepping out of view to get into the tent. The next footage was unfortunately corrupted for whatever reason, so I skipped ahead another few hours. At approximately 3 a.m, I saw a big, furry, wolf-like creature walk out of the woods, its eyes shining brightly in the dark. It was carrying the same dead turkey from before in its jaws. The creature then walked over to the tent, dropped the turkey to the ground, and reared up on its hind legs like a bear. I felt chills run through my skin as the animal leaned forward and disappeared completely from the camera. Not only had it torn open my tent, but it had crawled into the tent with me as I was sleeping. I held my breath, desperately waiting for the animal to come crawling out of my tent and run back to the woods where it had come. But it never did. Instead, as the sun rose up over the backyard, I saw myself climb through the hole in the tent, walk over to the camera, and shut it off. After the footage was over, I felt anxious and confused. Even though that shot of it entering the tent was out of the view of the camera, I'd expected to see some sort of movement from its paws as it tore the tent open. It was as if the opening in the tent was already there when it entered the yard. Had it torn the tent open in the corrupted footage? Also, if it had slept with me in the tent the entire night, how come it wasn't there when I woke up? The footage should have shown it going through the opening, and it's not like there was any other way of leaving the tent. Then it hit me. I suddenly remembered all those mornings where I would wake up with dirty hands and feet for no explainable reason. And those mornings where my breath would smell worse than usual, as if I had devoured a whole bunch of rotting meat as a midnight snack. My heart sank. The entire room began to swirl around me as I struggled to stand. All of the pieces were falling into place. Why the creature only appeared at night while I was sleeping. Why I was the only one in town who had never seen the thing. Why the camera had caught it entering the tent but not leaving. It turns out the camera had caught the creature leaving the tent, and that creature was the one who set up the camera in the first place.
Werewolf Ears by Colpick.
Did you hear about Sal? Jimmy lifted his eyes from work, looked at George's reflection, and replied, Sal? No. What's up with him? He probably spent more time hovering over people, talking to their reflections in the large mirror on the wall than he did conversing with them face to face. The unique perspective of people in his profession never failed to make him feel more like a fly on the wall than an actual participant in conversation. Jimmy looked at people like he did puzzle pieces. Sure, most of them seemed to be same or quite similar, but if you picked one piece out of the pile, you could see its own unique shape. It amazed him how all these singular pieces somehow managed to fit together. Sure, every now and again you'd have a piece that needed to be pressed into place with a little more force than the others, or a piece that went missing, but no picture was perfect. All the one-on-one conversations he'd had with most of the male inhabitants of the town over the past 40-odd years had made him feel like a kind of counselor or advisor to the town. Oh, you haven't heard? Sal's in the hospital. Some sort of coma. George hoped his enthusiasm for delivering this juicy bit of gossip didn't come off as uncaring. Coma? He was just in here last week. He lowered his scissors and looked right at George's reflection with a stunned look on his face. Come to think of it, he said he had a doctor's appointment later that day. He wasn't looking too good either. Yeah, according to Sue, the doctors don't know what's wrong with him. He just collapsed last night while playing bingo at the church. Oh, and get this. Carl's son, Kevin, the one with the exterminator business, disappeared the other day. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of him in a few days. Jimmy stood there thinking about his conversation with Sal the other day. That seems normal enough to me. Doesn't Kevin have a girlfriend who lives out of town? He probably just shacked up with her. He does, but he's missed appointments, and nobody's heard from him, answered George with the air of certainty. He loved to be the guy with all the answers. Jimmy scratched his head. You know, now that I think about it, Sal mentioned having Kevin spray his attic last week. Said he had some sort of infestation up there. Get this. According to him, his entire attic was covered in some sort of webbing, and it was squirming with what looked like thin, short strands of string. George turned his head at Jimmy, his expression a big question mark. What, like silkworms? I've never heard of an infestation like that before. Jimmy spun George around in the barber chair and looked straight at him. Me neither, and that's what he said. Little white strands hanging from webs. It was strange the other day. Sal comes in here for a haircut every 2 weeks like clockwork. I don't recall him ever going longer than 2 weeks without one. But when he came in here the last time, he looked like he hadn't been in the shop in a couple of months. His hair was a lot longer than it should have been, and it was stark white. George didn't seem too impressed. He's an old white hair. He has been for years." "No, his hair used to be gray. There's a difference. Trust me, I notice these things. Who else but me knows about that dent on the back of your head?" George defensively reached back and rubbed the back of his head. Okay, you're the expert. "And another thing," Jimmy said, cutting George off. "He had the wildest werewolf ears I've ever seen." George's puzzled expression beckoned Jimmy to elaborate. "Oh, it's something my father used to say to customers with hair in or on their ears. Sal never had much hair before, but the other day his ears were like a damn jungle." Jimmy decided not to mention that he thought he had seen some of the werewolf hairs twitching when he was sweeping them up later on. He had blamed it on drinking more than 2 cups of coffee than usual that day. George settled back in his chair. "Well, it seems to me like we're carrying on in 3 different conversations here. I don't see what any of this has to do with Sal being in a hospital. I'm going to check on him later today when I pick up Sue from there." Jimmy absent-mindedly brushed a white hair off his arm, spun George back around, and returned to the task at hand. Jimmy didn't have another customer after George left. He'd had plenty of boring days like today. Waiting for people to drag themselves into the barber shop for a haircut was just part of the job. He tossed back 3 aspirin and washed them down with a swig of old, burnt coffee. He decided to see if Sal could just get his headache to subside a bit. He'd been feeling it slowly ramping up all day, and now it was making it hard to think straight. "That's it," he said aloud to the empty shop. He was tired and just wanted to go home and sleep off whatever he was coming down with. He shut off the lights, grabbed his coat, and locked up. As he stepped out of sight of the front display window, something about the size of a child's fist slipped down from the ceiling on a thin strand of filament. It landed on the counter littered with the tools of the barber's trade and swiftly headed down towards the back room. It came across a stray white hair, attached it to a strand of silk hanging from its spinneret, and dragged it along behind it as it crawled down the counter to the floor and entered the back room. It approached a garbage bag lying in front of the back door, easily slit the plastic bag of the hair open, and began to emit a shrill sound reminiscent of a whistling kettle. Slowly over the next several minutes, little white hairs slipped out of the bag and slinked towards the source of the noise. It then attached them one by one to the ever-lengthening strand of silk trailing behind it. It crawled back to the place in the ceiling it originally came through with its collection of twitching white things in tow and slipped out of sight. The laden silk strand quickly followed and vanished into the ceiling as well. A cargo van was haphazardly parked about 10 feet off of an old dirt road in the middle of the forest. Its sides were emblazoned with identical logos that read, "Kapow Extermination." A pale-skinned man sat stiffly in the front seat. The top of his skull was ripped open like the top of a pan of Jiffy Pop. Chubby white worms, engorged with brain matter, squirmed inside of the man's exposed skull. They wriggled here and there all over his lap and the front of the seats of the van. A spider about the size of a baseball sat in the passenger seat. Its silvery sheen gave it an almost mechanical appearance. It had a worm pinned to the seat by its pedipalps. Emaciated little husks of worms lay all around it. The back seat was covered in a glistening, almost translucent pattern of silk. Little white strands were woven into the pattern like some sort of twitching tapestry. I live in a small village called Milam in Norfolk. It's a nice, quiet place, but it doesn't have much going for it. Honestly, I rather like it this way. I never grow tired of the scenic countryside beauty, unblemished by the modern world. Milam is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and everyone's business. A one-pub town, as they say. The area doesn't attract too many tourists either, which again is fine by me. If there's one thing I can't stand, it's the thought of us trying to cater to strangers. No, I'm not xenophobic. If you want to visit Milam, I'll gladly open my home to you. Hell, I'll even buy you a drink and spend the evening sharing stories. What I don't want are droves of tourists flooding the area and the village, trying to remodel itself and build new establishments to accommodate. I live here because it's quiet. If I wanted to navigate through clusters of tourists taking selfies, I'd move to bloody London. But I digress. Milam is and always will be my home. But there's one thing about it that disturbs me. One thing you won't find in the papers or in those little United Kingdom tourist pamphlets. Specifically, we have a history of people who've exhibited a rather strange set of behaviors. Aaron Cox. He was the latest victim of the affliction that has quietly plagued my village since the 1700s. No one knows exactly when it started, only that it's as much ingrained in our history as fibers are ingrained in a tapestry. It always starts the same way too. Chickens go missing, then cows are found mutilated, and finally someone breaks. This time, Aaron was the one who broke. I found him naked in my field one night, staring up at the sky and howling at the full moon. He had what I can only describe as a wild look in his eye. I dared not approach him, unsure of what to do. The village hadn't experienced this affliction since my parents' generation. I stood idly by and watched him writhing from beyond an irrigation channel. When the moon became masked behind a mass of clouds, he slowly walked by, as though nothing had happened. At the time, I'd hoped it was nothing more than a bout of drunken shenanigans, but I became more concerned the next day when I saw his wife Elizabeth and asked her if he'd gotten home all right. When I told her about the encounter, she grew more agitated. She dodged my questions, claimed he'd been out of town, and excused herself. Somehow, I had a feeling she knew more than she was letting on. That very same night, I heard the howling again. It echoed through the valley, giving the impression of multiple voices from different sources. Aaron was outside, staring up at the sky and waving his arms like a drowning man hailing a ship. He switched oddly between mad laughter and eerie howls, as though conversing with an unseen presence. I closed my shutters and tried to sleep, ignoring the ruckus outside. It only occurred to me in the morning to call his wife. When I finally did, she sounded terribly flustered. She told me Aaron had come home that afternoon. She'd said he'd acted perfectly normal. They'd gone to bed together, and in bed, they remained until morning. The hairs on the back of my neck stood. Was the bitch lying to me, or was it truth? If Aaron had not been in the field, then who had? That day, I asked around town if anyone had gone missing, and if anyone had heard or seen the man in my field. No one had. The Williams had lost a few chickens, but as always they blamed foxes. They'd found a spot in the chicken wire fence where claws or fangs had cut through to allow entry. These things happened. With nothing to go on, I gave up my search and returned to my chores. As I lay my head on the pillow that night, I heard a commotion coming from my barn. My cows were screaming. Have you ever heard the noise they make when you take their calves away? It's a kind of panicked, higher-pitched yowl you wouldn't ever hear in any other circumstance. Well, that was the sound they were making. only louder and more panicked. I threw on a robe, grabbed a flashlight, and dashed out to my barn. One of my cows was sprawled out in the middle of the central aisle, her throat ripped open with a jagged, messy gash. She was still breathing, still trying to emanate that scream, but her sounds were muffled and strangely gurgled. I knelt down in front of her and gently caressed her head, trying to ease her pain as best I could. At that moment I wished I owned a shotgun so I could have put her out of her misery. Then I heard the crackle of dry straw coming from her stall and a pathetic little whimper. I twisted my head towards the pen and saw the outline of something curled up in the corner. I shone my light towards it. Aaron Cox twitched as the beam of light hit him. His eyes glowed like those of a cat's in the night, but he was otherwise normal. There was no fur, no claws, and no fangs. Just a scrawny man in his bloody birthday suit. He let out a strange howl and bolted out of the pen on all fours, pharaoh-like, disappearing into the night to do God knows what. I could hear his howls in the distance as I tended my cow. Before long I was pounding on the door of the Cox household. Elizabeth Cox answered. She looked tired, but her hair was still in place. Clearly she hadn't gone to bed. "What's going on?" I barked angrily. She smiled nervously, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "I don't know what you're talking about. Are you all right?" "Like hell you don't. Where's Oren? Or are you going to pretend he's in your bed again?" I asked. She stiffened and gripped the hem of her shirt. "Oren's fine. It's none of your damn business." I stomped my foot on the ground. "He made it my business when he killed Betsy." Elizabeth winced. "I'm so sorry. He hasn't been himself lately." She trailed off, lowering her gaze in shame. "Was he even with you yesterday, or was that a lie?" I said. She didn't answer. "Do you know what's going on with him?" I pressed. I... She paused, looking uncomfortable. She moved aside and motioned me to follow her into the living room, so I did. "It's the moon," she whispered. "The moon?" She nodded. "He said he can hear it calling to him. I know it sounds mad. Please, I don't want him to get locked up. It'll pass. I'm sure it'll pass. He's just sick. Haven't your parents ever told you about this? It happens sometimes. They..." Her eyebrows came together. She held her breath and tensed. "Sometimes they get better on their own." I leaned against the wall, remembering the stories my parents had told me. Stories of people going mad, tiny outbreaks of some sort of disease, they thought. It hadn't happened in so long. It was assumed they were cases of mad cow disease or something of that sort, but back then they hadn't the tools to test for it yet. Could this be what was happening now? "Aaron clearly needs to get help," I told her. She shook her head. "It'll pass, I promise. I don't want to risk him getting institutionalized. I promise, I'll keep him inside from now on." Reluctantly, I relented. As long as he stayed away from my livestock, it didn't really matter to me what he did. Besides, I didn't want to be the one who had one of the village's beloved citizens sent to the loony bin. It would get out, people would talk, I would get shunned, and so would Elizabeth. I didn't want that for her or me, so I promised to keep quiet. Still, I couldn't help thinking of what she said, or rather, what Aaron had told her. The moon. He said it spoke to him. I'd seen him howl to it twice now. I'd seen him so completely entranced by it that he didn't notice my presence at all. I'm sure you've heard the term lunatic before, right? Do you know the origins of the word? Lunatic comes from the Latin word luna, the moon. They used to think the moon caused all mental illnesses. Something about its light keeping people awake at night, making people lose their minds. And when you think about it, is it that impossible? If the moon is strong enough to influence the tides, just imagine what it can do to the human body. Think about it. We're comprised of around 70% water, or so the scientists say. Really, it's almost silly to think that the moon can't affect us. And in Milam, a little village so far from the bright city lights, the moon seems to glow twice as strong. What I'm trying to say is that when I woke up early this morning with blood and chicken feathers caked on my lips, when I felt how sore my throat was, when I saw the moon shining through the clouds and felt the distant magnetic hum it emitted, I understood. It's beautiful. The curve of it, the deep craters that scar its silver surface. They leave me with this feeling of admiration welling inside me. They leave me with a desire. No. A need to go outside and greet it. It shines so bright. It's so beautiful. I understand now. There's nothing wrong with getting a little moonstruck.